For nearly 6 weeks, I had been telling everyone I was going home to Canada. I told my daughter Amber. I told my old colleague Len, who'd been sending me retirement updates from his place outside Winnipeg since I left. I even filled out an online inquiry form with a moving company, just to see what a rough estimate would look like. In my head, the decision was already made. Vietnam was done. I was going back. Then one evening, I sat down at the kitchen table here in Hội An with a legal pad and a calculator and actually figured out what going home was going to cost me. Not the flight. Everything after the flight. A one-bedroom apartment. The damage deposit, which in Manitoba now runs 2 full months' rent up front. A used car, because you cannot live in Winnipeg without a car, especially from October onward. Insurance on that car. Winter tires, which I'd managed to completely forget were a thing I used to pay for every year. A phone plan. Groceries. Furniture, because I'd sold most of mine before I left. Renter's insurance. The ordinary things I hadn't been paying for in Canadian dollars for 3 years. I filled 2 pages of the legal pad. Somewhere on the second page, I stopped writing. Because the number at the bottom wasn't impossible, but it scared me in a way that moving overseas in the first place never had. I could afford to buy the plane ticket. I just wasn't sure I could afford what happened after I landed. My name doesn't matter much for this story. I'm just a retired Canadian who came to Vietnam because I thought my pension would go further here. And it did. That part wasn't a lie. What I didn't fully reckon with was that after a few years of living this way, Canada's cost of living could start to feel like a different country's entirely. Not a country I didn't love. Just one I'd have to rebuild myself in, from scratch, on a fixed income that hadn't changed. I spent 31 years working for the provincial government. Before I retired, I'd run the numbers on my Canada pension plan and my old age security and decided I had enough to live decently. That calculation turns out to depend heavily on what year you're making it in, and what decently means in that particular housing market. I retired at 63. The first year was manageable. CPP was coming in, OAS followed at 65, and I was renting a place I could afford without much strain. Then my landlord, a reasonable man genuinely, told me my renewal was going to be $600 more per month than I'd been paying. Not $6,600, and this was Winnipeg, not Toronto, not Vancouver. I paid the new rate for 4 months and felt something wearing down in me every time I did. I wasn't struggling. I don't want to make it sound more dramatic than it was. But I had started doing the thing I told myself retirement would end. I was calculating constantly. Every purchase came with a small internal audit. Do I need this? Can it wait? Is there a cheaper version I'm not seeing? I remember standing in a superstore aisle one Saturday morning, holding 2 bags of frozen peas, comparing the price difference between the store brand and the name brand, doing arithmetic in my head over $1.40. That's the kind of moment that makes you wonder what exactly you worked 31 years for. I started reading about retiring abroad, the way a person reads about something they're not seriously considering, and then gradually, the way someone reads about something they are. Vietnam kept appearing in the research. Len had moved to Thailand and wouldn't stop emailing me about it, and through him I'd started paying closer attention to the actual numbers. Rent for a comfortable 1-bedroom in Hội An, somewhere between 500 and 700 Canadian dollars a month. Food was a fraction of what I spent in Winnipeg. No car needed, no car insurance, no winter tires, no scraping frost off a windshield at 7 in the morning in February, when the wind chill has pushed things down past -30. That last point might sound minor. It's not. After 35 prairie winters, no more winter tires carries a weight that's difficult to convey to someone who hasn't lived it. I came over with enough savings to feel like I hadn't made a reckless leap. I kept my provincial health card active as long as I legally could. I bought a return ticket the first time, just in case. I told Amber, if I genuinely hate it, I'll be home before Christmas. She gave me the look she gives when she's not entirely convinced, but is choosing to be supportive anyway. I wasn't home before Christmas. Not that Christmas, and not the one after it. The first year here was more than fine. My CPP and OAS covered my expenses, and there was money left at the end of the month. That hadn't happened in years. I'm not talking about a large surplus, enough for the odd meal out, enough to occasionally take a day trip somewhere, enough to stop counting every transaction as a potential problem. Just breathing room. I'd forgotten what that felt like. I wasn't living extravagantly. I want to be clear about that, because the word Vietnam sometimes conjures an image of hammocks and cocktails, and a life that doesn't resemble retirement so much as a very long vacation. It wasn't that. It was normal. I bought vegetables at the morning market. I cooked more than I expected to. I walked a lot. I found a cafe where I read in the afternoons, and I found a table in that cafe that became mine in the way that tables become yours when you sit at them enough times. And then, after the novelty wore off, I started noticing everything I missed. It started with small things. The particular sound of Canadian English everywhere around me without effort. Hockey night in Canada. I tried to stream it, but the lag made it unwatchable, and I gave up after 2 frustrating attempts. A proper double-double from a real Tim Hortons, not the approximation I'd learned to make at home. The smell of rain on a Canadian street. Amber's voice without that slight hesitation that comes with a poor connection. Small things are strange. You dismiss each one because individually none of them justify a major life decision. Then they accumulate. One morning I woke up irritable because I couldn't find the brand of maple syrup I grew up with, and suddenly I was questioning 2.5 years of choices. I convinced myself of something that felt very logical. I was Canadian. I should live in Canada. I should be close enough to Amber that visiting her didn't require 6 weeks of coordination and an international flight. I should be able to walk into a grocery store and already know where everything was. I told Amber first. She was careful about it. Amber is always careful. It's one of the things I most respect about her. But she said she'd be glad to have me closer. I told Len in an email that I'd be back in Canada by fall. I even called my old property manager, just to ask whether the building I used to live in had vacancies coming up. It didn't, but the act of calling felt like progress. The problem was I hadn't yet done the actual math. When I finally sat down with the legal pad, I started with rent. I wasn't looking for the cheapest possible place. I wanted somewhere I'd actually feel comfortable, a decent 1-bedroom, laundry in the building, a neighborhood I recognized. I searched listings for Winnipeg, then Saskatoon, then a few smaller cities where I thought affordability might be better. The numbers were not what I remembered. A 1-bedroom in a neighborhood I genuinely want to live in was running between $600 and $2,200 per month. Before utilities, which in a Manitoba winter can add another $200 to $300 on top of that. I looked at Brandon, Portage la Prairie, cheap, yes, but then I was looking at needing a car again, which meant car payments, insurance, gas, maintenance, winter tires. My CPP and OAS together come to roughly $1,900 a month. That's a normal retirement income for someone in my situation. Not unusual, not low by historical standards, just what it is. In Hội An, that $1,900 covers everything and leaves something over. In Winnipeg, it covered a modest apartment's rent and approximately nothing else. I hadn't thought about this as a problem when I left because I hadn't needed to. I assumed I could always go back the way you assume you can always return to a restaurant you used to like without considering whether the menu has changed or whether you can still order the same things. Amber called during this period and I was short with her. She asked if something was wrong. I told her I was fine and that I'd call her back. I didn't call her back that evening. I was too busy working through a list of things I blamed myself for. The anger was quick. I should have kept the car. I'd sold a reliable Honda to my neighbor's son for $8,000. Replacing it with something equivalent would cost me more than double that now. I should have kept more things in storage instead of donating them before I left. I should have kept a stronger connection to my landlord back home in case I ever needed a reference. And underneath all of that, the thought I kept returning to, maybe I should never have left. That's not a useful thought when you're 2.5 years into something. But fear isn't interested in usefulness. For about 3 weeks I lived in that state, wanting to go, afraid to go, staying in Vietnam while slowly building a case against it for things that weren't its fault. The heat that I'd gotten used to suddenly bothered me again. The traffic noise at night started waking me up. Every time the internet slowed down, which happens here, same as it happens in rural Manitoba, but I'd conveniently stopped remembering that. I caught myself thinking about how this wouldn't happen in Canada. Then Amber said something that stuck. We were on a video call, and I had been venting more than I should have, going in circles about feeling stuck. She stopped me. She asked, "Dad, are you unhappy there? Or are you unhappy because you've already decided you should leave?" I told her those sounded like the same thing. She said they weren't. Then she asked me something else. She reminded me that a year earlier I'd told her that my morning walks were one of the best parts of my day, and that the market near my apartment was the thing I'd most recommend to anyone considering Hội An. She asked whether any of that had changed. I didn't have a good answer, because the walks were still good, the market was still good. None of the actual texture of my daily life here had changed. What had changed was the story I was telling myself about where I was supposed to be. I thought about what she said for a few days. Then I booked a flight to Winnipeg. Not to move back. I told myself I was going to visit, spend some time with Amber, look at a few apartments in person instead of on a screen, and see whether the numbers felt different when I was actually standing in Canada. I was excited in a way I hadn't expected. I started looking forward to things I hadn't thought about in months. A proper Tim Hortons order. Driving again. I used to love driving, and I hadn't done it in over 2 years. The particular ease of being surrounded by English everywhere without effort. Walking into a Costco like a regular person. Seeing Amber's face without the pixelation. I was even looking forward to the possibility of cold weather, which tells you everything about how far the homesickness had gone. When I landed in Winnipeg, the first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Amber picked me up. We stopped at Tim Hortons without any discussion. She ordered for me without asking because she already knew what I wanted. I slept better than I had in weeks. Everything sounded familiar. Everything felt like it was in the right place. For about 3 days, I was completely certain I was coming back. Then Amber went to work. She's a project coordinator for a construction firm. She has long days, her own schedule, her own life organized around her own needs. She told me to treat her place like my own, and she meant it. But I was a retired man sitting alone in his daughter's apartment on a Tuesday morning, and I hadn't yet figured out what to do with that. So I started touring apartments. The first one was in a West End neighborhood I knew, close to a grocery store, somewhere I could picture walking around. It looked better in the listing. In person, the building was a bit tired, but what really altered the calculation was when the leasing agent walked me through the additional fees. Parking, a monthly amenities fee, a building administration charge I didn't fully understand, and the deposit structure. First and last month's rent, both in full before move-in. I did the math while she was still talking. The cost of simply getting into that apartment, before I'd bought a single chair, was going to be close to $5,000. I thanked her. I walked to the rental car. I sat in the parking lot for a while. The second apartment was nicer and more expensive. The third was cheaper, but placed me in a part of the city where living without a car would have been genuinely difficult. So I looked at used cars. Not nice ones, just something reliable, a few years old, decent mileage, the kind of car I drive to the pharmacy and back. A 2019 Honda Civic with around 90,000 kilometers was listed at $23,000. Then I called about insurance, and the number they gave me was one I had to hear twice to be sure I'd understood correctly. One afternoon I drove to the superstore near Amber's place to pick up a few things for dinner. I walked through it the way you walk through a place that should be completely familiar, but keeps surprising you anyway. The layout was right. The brands were right. The prices were not what I remembered. I bought a rotisserie chicken, salad greens, bread, yogurt, a box of crackers, and 2 cans of soup. When the total appeared on the register screen, I looked back into my basket the way a person looks when they're sure they must have accidentally picked up something expensive. I hadn't. It was exactly what I'd meant to buy. That was the moment when my memory of Canada and the Canada I was actually standing in stopped being the same place. Because the Canada I'd been missing from my kitchen table in Hội An had a particular cost attached to it. And that cost was from several years ago, before the inflation, before the rental market went where it went. The Canada in my memory was familiar and manageable. The Canada in front of me was familiar, and the numbers were different. A few evenings before my flight, Amber and I were sitting at her kitchen table after dinner. She asked how the apartment search was going. I told her the truth. Not well. The places I'd want to live were beyond what my pension would comfortably cover. The places within my budget required a car I hadn't accounted for. She offered to let me stay with her. Not temporarily, permanently, if that's what I needed. She said it the way Amber says things she means, plainly, without ceremony. I considered it for a moment. It would solve the immediate financial problem. No deposit, no rush on furniture, time to think through the car situation carefully. On paper it made sense. But I looked around her kitchen, the photographs on the fridge, the calendar with her schedule on it, the particular way she organizes her counter space, and I understood that this was her home, her rhythm, her life. I'd be fitting myself around the edges of it, a room in her apartment, a schedule built around hers, quietly wondering whether she minded when I cooked at certain hours. Back in Hội An, I had none of those negotiations. I had my own space, my own routine, my own decision about when to go out and when to stay in, and when to do absolutely nothing all afternoon. I'd spent weeks complaining about Vietnam and had nearly forgotten what I'd actually built there. I wasn't ready to say I wanted to stay in Vietnam, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to leave it either. I spent my last 10 days in Canada paying more careful attention. I drove through parts of Winnipeg I'd known well. I had lunch with Len. We spent 2 hours at a diner he liked, catching up properly for the first time in years. He'd moved to a smaller town for affordability. He said it was an adjustment, but he was managing. He looked well. I was glad to see him. I went to a hockey game with Amber. Not the Jets. The tickets for those are a different budget, but a minor league game where you can get in for $30, and the atmosphere is genuinely good. Sitting there with popcorn and the ice and the noise of a crowd that was just there to watch hockey, I felt something that was close to the Canada I'd been missing for 2 years. It was real. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But by the time we got home that night, I'd spent nearly $250 on the evening, between tickets and parking and food. In Hội An, I could eat well for a week on that. I'm not saying Canada was wrong for the cost. I'm just saying the accounting was real and I could no longer pretend it wasn't. The night before my flight, Amber asked me directly what I'd decided. I told her I was going back. She looked surprised. Then she asked whether I was going back because I wanted to, or because I couldn't afford to stay. I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer had 2 parts. Money was a significant part of it. On my CPP and OAS, the gap between my cost of living in Hội An and my cost of living in Winnipeg was close to $1,000 a month. Over a year, that's the difference between my savings staying stable and my savings slowly draining. That's not a small consideration for someone who doesn't know exactly how many more years that money needs to last. But the money wasn't everything anymore. I'd been in Canada for 3 weeks. I'd walked the streets, toured the apartments, sat in the grocery stores, gone to a hockey game, had coffee with Len, spent evenings with Amber, and I hadn't found the life I'd been missing. Not exactly. I'd found something more complicated, a place I genuinely loved that had genuinely changed, that I'd also genuinely left. The Canada I'd been homesick for was a specific version, a particular period, a particular set of prices, a particular set of routines I'd had when I was still working, and my life had a different shape. That version didn't exist anymore, not because Canada had become bad, just because time moves, and it had been moving without me. In Hội An I had built something, nothing remarkable, just the ordinary texture of a daily life. A barber who knew how I wanted my hair, a market stall where I bought vegetables twice a week, a cafe table that had become mine through repetition, a neighbor who occasionally appeared at my door with fruit from her family's place outside the city. The kind of small routine that takes time to build anywhere, and that you only understand the value of when you're about to dismantle it. When I boarded the flight back, I expected to feel something like defeat, like I'd tried to come home and been turned away. Instead, somewhere over the Pacific, I felt calm. Not excitement, not certainty about the future, just quiet, and the knowledge that I was going somewhere I understood, where my rent was paid, where the woman at the morning market would nod when she saw me because she recognized me now. After months of sitting inside anxiety about a return that I'd been building up in my head, the predictability of my actual life started to feel like something worth having. When I got back to Hội An, I made a few changes. I stopped treating my budget like a survival exercise. I'd been running a kind of leftover austerity from the Winnipeg years. The memory of that $600 rent increase still sitting somewhere in my habits, and I'd forgotten that the whole point of being here was to actually live. So I bought a better fan for the bedroom, a small thing I'd been putting off for months because the old one was technically functional. I started taking taxis when the distance was too far to walk comfortably. I signed up for a cooking class I'd been looking at for over a year, and I booked a flight to Winnipeg for March, not to look at apartments, just to see Amber, just to visit. That last part matters more than any of the others. One of the mistakes I'd made while I was sitting in Hội An missing Canada was treating geography as binary. Either I was there or I was here. Either I belonged in Canada or I'd given Canada up. That kind of thinking made every hard day feel like evidence of the wrong choice, like something that urgently needed to be corrected. But I live in Vietnam and my daughter lives in Winnipeg, and both of those things can be true at the same time without needing to be resolved. I visit when I can, because my cost of living here is what it is. I can do more often than I could if I were spending $2,000 a month on rent. That's not a compromise. That's actually one of the more practical advantages of the situation I'm in. I also set aside what I think of as a backdoor fund. It's separate from my regular savings. It's enough to cover one return flight to Canada, 2 months of living expenses while I figured out my next step, and a damage deposit on a modest apartment if I genuinely needed one in an emergency. Knowing it exists, knowing I could leave if something truly necessary required it, changed everything about how being here feels. I'm not trapped. I was never trapped. I just hadn't done the math properly, and when I finally did, the number frightened me before I understood what it actually meant. If I could give anyone in a similar situation one piece of practical advice, it would be this. Before you calculate whether you can afford to leave Canada, calculate what it would cost to come back. Not the airfare, the deposit and the car and the furniture and the insurance, and the first 3 months of groceries at current prices. Not the prices in your memory. Do that math before you go, so you're making a real decision with real numbers instead of a theoretical one. And then, if the numbers still work and you still want to go, set aside a fund specifically for returning if you need to. Call it whatever you like. Just don't touch it for anything else. It will cost you almost nothing to maintain, and it will change how you feel about your life every single day. And on the other side, don't let the fear of not being able to return prevent you from actually living wherever you are. I spent months in a perfectly good apartment, in a city where my money worked, watching the light on the river in the evenings, and thinking about Winnipeg instead of being where I was. That's not retirement. That's waiting. This morning I walked to the market at 6:30. I bought mangoes, a bag of fresh rice noodles, some herbs I've learned to cook with. I stopped at the cafe and had a coffee and read for an hour. I sent Amber a photo of the river because the light was good. The kind of light that makes a place look like the place it actually is, and I thought she'd want to see it. She sent back a photo of ice on her windshield and one word, rude. Nothing remarkable happened. Nothing needed to. I used to say I couldn't afford to go home. I don't say that anymore. What I couldn't afford was to recreate a specific version of a Canadian life that had moved on without me. Overnight, on a fixed income, without a plan. That's a different problem, and it has different solutions. I chose to be here. Not because I had no other option. Not because I was too frightened to figure one out. But because when I finally held both lives up honestly and looked at them clearly, this was the one that made more sense for who I actually am now and what I actually have. The one where I can breathe at the end of the month and still put money aside for March, when I'll sit in Amber's kitchen and drink coffee and she'll tell me about work and I'll tell her about the market and neither of us will have to schedule it months in advance because it's already on the calendar. That's not a compromise. That's just how my life is arranged now. The mango was good this morning. The coffee was good. And when Amber's face appeared on my screen that evening, a little pixelated from the connection, I didn't feel the ache I used to feel. I just felt glad to see her. For now, that is enough. For now, it is more than enough.